She used to wake up to the sound of roosters crowing in the distance, a sound that would start faint and then grow as the other farms joined in, a chorus that marked the beginning of another day that would be exactly like the one before. And she would lie there for a moment, feeling the rough wool of her blanket against her skin, smelling the wood smoke from the kitchen below, hearing her mother moving about downstairs preparing breakfast. And there was a rhythm to those mornings that felt as solid as the earth itself, a rhythm built from chores that never changed, from feeding the animals and drawing water from the well and mending clothes by the fire. Tasks that were so familiar they required no thought, just the steady movement of hands that knew what to do without being told. And she would move through those hours with a kind of peaceful detachment, watching the sunlight move across the floorboards, feeling the heat of the hearth on her face, listening to the sounds of her family talking about ordinary things, about the weather and the crops and the price of wool at market. And sometimes she would go outside and stand in the yard, looking at the fields stretching out to the horizon, and she would feel a connection to that landscape so deep it was like being rooted to the ground, like her feet were growing into the soil, and she would think about nothing in particular, just the feel of the wind on her skin, the smell of damp earth after rain, the way the clouds moved across the sky in patterns that seemed to mean something if only you knew how to read them. And there was no anticipation in those days, no sense that anything was about to change, just the steady turning of seasons, the planting and harvesting, the coming and going of light. And she would fall asleep each night exhausted from work, but content in a way that needed no examination. Because contentment doesn't need to be examined, it just is, like breathing, like the beating of your own heart, something you only notice when it stops. And she had no way of knowing, as she went about her chores, as she laughed with her brothers, as she knelt in church on Sundays, that she was being watched, not by anyone in particular, but by the world itself, by the way her body moved through space, by the way her voice carried when she spoke, by the particular set of her shoulders when she worked, all of it being noted somewhere, stored away for future use. Because the world has a way of noticing people before they notice themselves, of marking them for roles they haven't yet imagined. And the most dangerous thing about those ordinary days was how ordinary they felt, how they lulled you into believing that tomorrow would be the same, that the ground beneath your feet was solid, that the walls of your home would keep you safe, when in fact they were already beginning to crack, already beginning to shift, already preparing to give way beneath you. The comments began as whispers at first, things she would overhear when she passed groups of people in the village, remarks about how she walked with a strange confidence for someone so young, how her eyes seemed to see things others couldn't, how she had a way of speaking that made people stop and listen even when she was talking about ordinary things. And she would blush and hurry past, thinking they were just being kind, or maybe making fun of her. She could never tell which. But the whispers grew louder, became conversations she wasn't part of, discussions about her that happened in rooms she never entered, and people started looking at her differently. Not with malice, but with a kind of intense curiosity, as if she were a puzzle they were trying to solve. And they would ask her questions, not about her thoughts or feelings, but about her body, about whether she ever heard voices when she was alone in the fields, whether she ever saw things that weren't there, whether she felt different after praying. And she would answer honestly, because she had been taught that honesty was a virtue. And her answers would be written down by men with serious faces and careful hands, men who would nod and make notes and ask more questions, always more questions, until she began to feel like she was being taken apart piece by piece, examined under a light too bright to bear. And she started noticing how people would watch her when she didn't think she was being watched, how they would study the way she held her head, the way her hands moved when she spoke, the particular rhythm of her breathing when she was concentrating. And she began to adjust without meaning to hold herself more carefully, to speak more softly, to move with less certainty, because being observed that closely makes you self-conscious in ways you can't control, makes you wonder if you're doing everything wrong, if the way you walk is strange, if the way you talk is odd, if your very existence is somehow incorrect. And the strange thing was how normal it all started to feel, how being examined became just another part of her day, like the chores she did or the prayers she said, something that happened to her rather than something she did. And she began to understand, in a vague, unformed way, that her body was no longer hers, not really, that it had become public property, something to be discussed and analyzed and categorized. And the most unsettling part was how politely it all happened, how everyone kept smiling and using respectful tones, as if they were doing her a great honor by paying such close attention, as if being turned into an object of study was a privilege rather than a violation. People started keeping their distance, not in an obvious way, but gradually, subtly, like water receding from shore. First, her friends would make excuses not to walk with her to market. Then her family would fall silent when she entered the room. Then even the priest would avoid her eyes during Mass, and she would find herself alone more and more often, standing in fields that suddenly felt too large, sitting in rooms that suddenly felt too empty. And when she tried to reach out, to bridge the growing distance between herself and everyone else, she would meet with polite smiles and careful words that said nothing at all, and doors that had always been open to her began to close, not with a slam, but with a soft click that was somehow worse. And she would stand outside them, listening to the sounds of life continuing on the other side, conversations she wasn't part of, laughter that didn't include her, and the silence around her grew thicker, not the silence of absence, but the silence of things being deliberately unsaid, of conversations stopping when she approached, of letters that never arrived, of invitations that were never extended. And she began to have dreams where she was shouting, but no sound came out, where she was running but going nowhere, where she was surrounded by people who looked right through her, as if she weren't there at all, and she would wake up sweating, her heart pounding, and for a moment she wouldn't know where she was. And then she would recognize the familiar cracks in the ceiling, the smell of straw from her mattress, the sound of her own breathing in the dark. And she would feel a relief so sharp it was almost painful, because she was still here, still in her room, still safe. But the feeling would fade by morning, replaced by a dull ache that followed her through the day like a shadow she couldn't shake. And she began to notice how people would cross the street to avoid her, how they would look away when she tried to catch her eye, how they would speak about her in the third person, even when she was standing right there, as if her existence was something to be discussed rather than experienced. And the loneliness wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how ordinary it felt, how it could be mistaken for peace if you didn't know better, how the quiet could almost be comforting if you forgot what it meant. They came for her on a day that started like any other, with the same roosters crowing, the same wood smoke smell, the same chores waiting to be done. And they were polite, excessively polite, men in clothes that were clean but not fine, who spoke in soft voices as if afraid to startle her. And they presented her with papers that had her name on them, but didn't feel like they belonged to her. Papers that used words like relocation and protective custody and temporary accommodation. And they told her she could bring one bag, just one. And she stood in her room looking at her things, trying to decide what parts of her life were essential and what parts could be left behind. and the ride through the countryside was conducted in a cart with curtains drawn tight, so she couldn't see the familiar fields passing by. And when they arrived, it wasn't a dungeon or a fortress, but a series of rooms that were clean and spare and utterly empty of anything personal. The walls bare, the furniture minimal, the windows too high to see out of properly. And they gave her a number to remember, a sequence of digits that would now precede her name on all documents. And they took her clothes and gave her others, plain ones that smelled of soap and starch and other people. And they explained the rules in a monotone voice, rules about when she could speak, when she could eat, when she could use the bathroom. And they would count her utensils after each meal, recording how much water she drank, noting the times she woke up during the night. And she learned to move through the routines without thinking, to eat when told, sleep when allowed, speak only when spoken to. And sometimes she would catch herself waiting for permission to scratch an itch or adjust her position in a chair. And she would lie awake at night listening to the sounds of the building, the distant footsteps of guards changing shifts, the soft scratching of pens on paper somewhere down the hall, the soft rustle of pages being turned in ledgers that contained her name, her number, her vital statistics, all reduced to data, to entries in a system that would outlive her, that would continue functioning long after she was gone.
They began with the time, measuring how long it took her to finish a meal, how many seconds she spent looking out the window, how many minutes passed between each breath when she was sleeping, and they would record these numbers in ledgers without looking at her face, their pens moving across the paper with a steady rhythmic scratch that became the background noise of her days. And then they moved to her movements, counting how many steps she took from one wall to another, how many times she turned her head to the left versus the right, how often her hands touched her face or hair or clothing, and they would discuss these numbers among themselves in low voices, comparing them to previous days, noting patterns and deviations as if she were a machine whose performance needed monitoring. And they would test her obedience by giving her contradictory instructions, telling her to stand when she had just been told to sit, to speak when she had just been told to remain silent, to eat when she had just been told to fast. And they would watch her closely as she tried to navigate these impossible commands, noting her hesitation, her confusion, the slight tremor in her hands when she realized there was no correct answer. And they would touch her without warning, adjusting her clothing, moving her hair from her face, checking her pulse, all with the same clinical detachment as a doctor examining a patient, except there was no diagnosis, no treatment, just the touch itself, repeated until it lost all meaning, until it became just another part of the routine, like being measured or counted or observed. And they would bring in other people sometimes, strangers who would stand at a distance and watch her eat or sleep or simply sit, and these visitors would make notes on small pads of paper, sketching diagrams of her posture, her expressions, the way she held her body when she thought no one was looking, and they would discuss her among themselves using terms she didn't understand, words that sounded technical and precise and utterly devoid of humanity. And the violence of it wasn't in any single act, but in the accumulation, in the way each small violation built upon the last, until there was nothing left that hadn't been touched, measured, recorded, analyzed, until she became a collection of data points rather than a person, a subject of study rather than a human being. And the most chilling part was how normal it all felt after a while, how being examined became as routine as breathing, how the presence of strangers in her room became as unremarkable as the furniture, how the constant surveillance became simply the condition of her existence, the air she breathed, the ground she walked on, the world she inhabited. The morning they took her, the air was cold and damp, and the sky was the color of wet slate, and they walked her through corridors that seemed longer than she remembered, past doors that were all closed, through courtyards that were empty except for guards standing at attention. And when they reached the square, the crowd was already there, a sea of faces that didn't roar or jeer, but simply watched, their expressions blank with a kind of weary curiosity, as if they were waiting for a performance to begin and weren't sure if it would be worth their time. And the platform was just wood, ordinary wood that had been worn smooth by countless feet, and the man who stood waiting wore clothes that were neither grand nor symbolic, just practical, dark wool stained with things she didn't want to identify. And he worked with a focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, checking his tools, testing the mechanism, wiping his hands on a rag. And when the moment came, there was no speech, no last words, no dramatic pause, just the sound of the mechanism engaging, a series of clicks and groans that were almost musical in their precision. And then it was over, and the crowd didn't erupt. They just stood there for a moment, as if waiting for something else to happen. And when nothing did, they began to disperse, talking among themselves about the weather, about the price of bread, about the long walk home. And the body was removed without ceremony, taken away on a cart that rattled over cobblestones, and the square emptied, leaving behind only the impression of footprints in the mud and the cold, indifferent sky. And somewhere in a nearby building, a clerk dipped his pen in ink and made a note in a ledger, recording the time, the date, the weather conditions, all the relevant data. And then he closed the book and stood up, stretching his stiff shoulders before heading home to his family, to his dinner, to his bed, where he would sleep without dreaming. Or if he did dream, he would dream of ordinary things, of debts to be paid, of chores to be completed, of small pleasures waiting at the end of the week.
And the next day, the sun rose as it always had, pale and tentative at first, then growing stronger until it washed the city in the same golden light that had touched 1,000 other mornings. And people went about their business, opening shops, hanging laundry, sending children off to school. And the system that had made it all possible continued to function, its gears turning with the same smooth, relentless efficiency, processing paperwork, assigning numbers, moving bodies from one place to another. And the men who had performed their duties went home to their families, ate their meals, slept in their beds. And the space where she had been was filled by someone else, a new name, a new number, a new set of observations to be recorded in ledgers that never seemed to run out of pages. And the world, in its vast, uncaring momentum, rolled forward, leaving behind only the faintest ripple, a slight adjustment in the way people looked at each other in the street, a new caution in their voices when they spoke of certain things. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city is still asleep, and the only sound is the distant rumble of carts bringing goods to market, you can almost hear it, the echo of something that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a sigh, just the sound of a page turning in a ledger that nobody reads anymore.